They said, oh, I can do that. Yes. Okay, I'll do that. Yes, it's all yours. Yes.
Right, hello colleagues, we are going to start the meeting, so welcome. My name is Liz Lawrence, I'm past president of the University College Union. Welcome, I'm chairing this meeting. Welcome to today's meeting on Truth for Giulio Regeni and Justice for Egypt Disappeared. Now this meeting is sponsored by UCU, by the Egypt Solidarity Initiative, by Leeds University Centre for African Studies, and by Amnesty International. Do come in. This is one of a series of meetings we've held. We've also had meetings so far in London, Cambridge, where Giulio was a PhD student, Manchester, Warwick Universities, and now Leeds. We have future meetings planned at Kingston and Queen Mary Universities. Just to deal with housekeeping, we are filming the speeches. We won't be filming questions and answers. If anybody's got any worries about going on film, we don't think you will be, we're just filming the speakers, but do let us know. Right, so just to say a little bit about Giulio. I understand he did his first degree here at the University of Leeds, studying Arabic and politics. He was a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, researching the independent trade union movement in Egypt. And on the 3rd of February 2016, his murdered body was found in a ditch on the outskirts of Cairo. The body showed the signs of extensive torture, similar to that which has been inflicted on many Egyptians who have disappeared as a result of repression in Egypt. And the repression in Egypt has been very severe in terms of people being imprisoned, sentenced to death and so on. Torture is widespread in Egyptian prisons. So a year after Giulio's murder, Amnesty International and UCU launched a campaign to demand justice for Giulio and other victims of disappearance in Egypt. We demand that the killers are brought to justice and that the repression in Egypt ends. So we'll be talking to people later about various solidarity activities that they can take part in. We do have a postcard campaign, and we will be at a later date making some of those postcards available. We have two speakers today. They're Professor Ray Bush from the University of Leeds and Shane Enright from Amnesty International. I'd like to invite Professor Bush first to speak. He's Professor of African Studies and Development Politics. He's researched and published extensively on political economy and economic and agrarian reform, particularly with regard to the situation in Egypt. I've been Deputy Chair of Review, Chair of the Journal of African Political Economy. So, welcome, Professor Bush.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I didn't know Giulio, even though he was a student in my department. As our chair has just indicated, he disappeared on the 5th anniversary of the 25th of January 2011 uprising, and his mutilated, tortured, half-clothed body was found in a ditch very close to headquarters of one of the security services in Egypt on the 3rd of February 2016. Nobody's been held accountable for this. The Egyptian state first said he had suffered trauma resulting from a road traffic accident. They then said, rethinking that they had actually shot dead a gang, criminal gang as they called it, of 4 sadists who had perpetuated the brutal murder. They nevertheless refused to give the names that the Italian law enforcement agencies have asked for, of 14 people that had come under suspicion by the Italian state. The bottom line for the Italians, and I think for many of us here, was echoed by La Repubblica in a recent article about Giulio, where they said that this was simply a case of state-sponsored murder. And I think we need to run our own forensic examination as to how or why we might adhere to that characterization. Researching in Egypt is never very straightforward, but it was always the case that as a European it was often thought that you could get access to information and people and sources of data that locals often could not get access to. And certainly one never feared for one's life in conducting research in Egypt. One did fear for harassment, but one needs to put even the brutality of Giulio's murder in a context, which is this. In 2016, there were more than 1,000 forced disappearances in Egypt, more than 500 cases of individual torture, more than 100 deaths in detention. And in the time that I have, I'd like to try and do quite quickly 4 things. I want to first of all try and provide a context for understanding the brutal murder of Giulio. Look at the mess that is Egypt's politics and its political economy. Ask why and how the tremendous optimism of the 25th of January 2011 very quickly and dramatically unravelled. And then explain why and how the security state and the increased repression in Egypt has been allowed to emerge with considerable collusion by the governments in the United States, Britain and the European Union. A couple of very preliminary observations. The first is that you would have noticed on the 2nd of March that the remaining villain of the ancient regime, Hosni Mubarak, was acquitted of involvement in any deaths associated with the 25th of January 2011 uprising. He's now free. The second comment to make is that in a quite extraordinary piece in the Washington Post earlier this month, on the 5th of March, it was reported that the Mukhabarat, or Egypt's General Intelligence Directorate, had hired 2 US public relations companies to promote the interests, how they described as the strategic partnership, showcasing Egypt's civil society in the United States. The Egyptian state was paying close to $2 million per annum for this honour of hiring 2 PR companies in the United States. Of course, that close to 2 million pales into insignificance compared to the US military support of $1.3 billion per annum. The government of Egypt clearly thinks that if it spins and communicates more effectively its characterization of existing democracy, it will be allowed to escape with what has become quite extraordinary social, political and economic clampdown in Egypt. So why and how has the security state emerged? Well, since Sisi's coup in July 2013, there's been an unprecedented intensification of security. The Ministry of Interior's budget is now greater than the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Education combined. There are more than 1.7 million security service personnel, including police, central security and state security investigation services. There's also been an extremely worrying outsourcing of thuggery towards criminal elements to run security for the state. This aspect of funding and supporting criminal elements emerged as a last resort by the state during January 2011 as it released criminals from prisons to try and destabilise and unsettle demonstrators. And of course these are the thugs which now receive protection from Egyptian police to run their protection rackets, whilst they're also outsourced as a police force for the state. They're the groups of people that generally sexually abuse female demonstrators and break up and intimidate protesters more generally. There's also been a privatisation of security in Egypt, where companies like Falcon, for example, and other private security companies are paid for by the state to try and disrupt, Sisi argues, the influence of unlawful foreign private security companies. Now, the security state, which I've just outlined, is seen as a bastion against the outrages of Democrats and the outrages of Islamists. Islamists who are seen to encroach and disrupt politics and society in Sinai, and also plant bombs and destabilise society in Cairo. Now, of course, this was never meant to happen. The optimism of January 2011 was quite extraordinary, and so too were the achievements, and they shouldn't be forgotten. Those achievements of removing the dictator Mubarak, removed 2 prime ministers, facilitated and promoting the drafting of 2 constitutions, reducing the time limits on presidential office, and providing judicial oversight for presidential elections. Of course, there was also the prosecution of corrupt officials, many of whom have now escaped judicial review, and there was, of course, revised presidential elections. In the context of Mubarak's period of dictatorship, these are major achievements. And Egypt will never, in terms of its characterisation of the possibility for democratic opening or political liberalisation, Egypt will never be the same. However, the dumping of Mubarak by Egypt's military, facilitated and promoted by the US State Department, did not gainsay the persistent strength of the military in the reconstruction of events after January 2011. Remember that the military in Egypt produced everything from washing machines to holiday resorts, own and manage more than 40 factories, restaurants, and of course have access to more than 500,000 conscript labourers, which is a free labour bonus for the military state. The military then remained in power and never really left power, and I think that's something we could discuss as a consequence of the type of uprising that emerged in 2011. But the repression was swift following January and February 2011. In October 11, 28 people were killed in Maspero, the television headquarters in the centre of Cairo. There were more than 60 deaths outside the Cabinet Office in November and December 2011. In the 16th of December, 14 were killed in Midan Tahrir, and especially there were particular attacks on female demonstrators at that time. And very dramatically and quite awfully, there was, in February 2012, the slaughter in a closed stadium in Port Said of football supporters who had been identified as the front guard in the demonstrations of 2011. And of course there was also the slaughter of 800 in 2 mosques in August 2013. These regular deaths of protesters has led to a polarisation of views of the character of politics in Egypt. It's a binary of politics. You either have Islamic mayhem or you have authoritarian democracy. And this was characterised by quite a surprising source, the Egyptian novelist al-Aswani, who, on commenting on the death of protesters in the mosques in August 13, in talking about the protesters, not about the state, said that they were a group of terrorists and fascists, as if to legitimise what Amnesty had characterised as probably the biggest single slaughter at any demonstration in recent times. So this is the binary, and it's the binary that the Egyptian state currently promotes, and it's a binary which effectively argues that Egypt promotes its strategic geostrategic rent. Sisi safeguards the West from the hordes of Islamists present within Egypt and closer through repressing the possibility of Islamic State emerging in Sinai and elsewhere. But we're still left with trying to explain how the optimism of 2011 was so easily crushed and messed up. How was it that Sisi managed quickly to come to power and topple Mohamed Morsi, a democratically elected Islamist president, who received only 51% of the vote, but nevertheless a majority vote for his presidential candidacy in 2012. But in the parliamentary elections, the Islamists got 70% of the votes. They got 350 seats out of 498. So there was a significant electoral force promoting and driving an Islamist government. The problem with Morsi, there were many problems with Morsi, but the problem with Morsi was that he could not keep the street quiet. Between 2011 and 2013, there were almost 8,000 industrial actions against the conditions of work, employment, wages, and so on. And this culminated in the Tamarot, the petition protesting the persistence of the Islamist government, and it precipitated Sisi's military intervention. And the military have affirmed their dominance with an escalation of the security state. And it's the reason behind why the uprisings have been so dramatically reversed. Why were the uprisings so dramatically reversed? Because the conditions that led to the uprising remain as pertinent today as they did on the eve of the uprisings in January 2011. The problem with the post-uprising politics is that they failed to grasp why it was that the uprisings took place. Let me just very briefly say what I mean by that. The long-term causes of repression in Egypt led to an explanation by Mubarak that repression was necessary to sustain geostrategic rent, that Islamists were a fear that would gobble up any democratic achievements that his or other governments might promote. The interesting thing is that leading up to the uprising in 2011, Egypt had had a 20-year unprecedented period of economic growth. Unprecedented period of economic growth. Over a 20-year period prior to 2011, per capita income rose by 3%. Now, any developing country would bite your hand off for that. The problem was, Egypt developed, but Egyptians didn't. Even the World Bank, who praised Mubarak, especially the neoliberal regime that was in place after 2004, even the World Bank recognised there were up to 44% poor Egyptians. Nada Fagani, an Egyptian statistician, would argue that actually more than 80% of Egyptians live on less than $2 a day. That makes Egyptians poorer than Zimbabweans. And that's an analogy Egyptians, for mostly the wrong reasons, would not like to be made. High levels of inequality, high levels of what have been characterised as crony capitalism, high levels of potential resistance to challenge that inequality, which led to a characterisation of medium-term causes to the uprisings in 2011. High levels of inflation, 20% food inflation between 2005 and 10. Now food inflation is in excess of 25%. High levels of worker demands for improved conditions of service. High number of strikes. In the mid-2000s, more than 2 million workers and families were involved in industrial actions. 2006, more than 28,000 workers in textile factories in Mahalla, which is the greatest concentration of industrial workers of anywhere in the Middle East, took to the streets and demanded not just improvement in living conditions and wages, but also political transformations that were being ushered in through other civil society organisations. The security state is now defended by the United States and the British government. There's a collusion with Sisi's authoritarianism, and it's cemented by what Jack Shenker, a journalist, an author on Egypt, has called a rebranding of Egypt's repression. A rebranding. Egypt's rebranding is caricatured now by the donor conference in Sharm el-Sheikh in the early months of 2015, in March 2015. It was called Egypt the Future. At that conference were gathered all the great and the good. Tony Blair, Mrs. Lagarde, they praised Sisi's move towards democracy. Blair praised Sisi for understanding the modern world with his leadership. Lagarde noted that Egypt's journey to higher growth had already begun. And Sisi himself talked about the Egyptian people with no reference to the uprisings that had preceded this direct foreign investment fest. But Sisi did say very ominously, and this is 2015, he said, take care when you are demanding your rights. Take care you don't lead us astray with you. He continued, we don't approve of the violation of human rights, but this is an exceptional stage in Egypt's history. Well, there's no leading astray by the international community. Au contraire, Egypt is now hailed as a bastion of the defence of civilization against IS. It's the gatekeeper on the concentration camp that is Gaza. It has favourable relations with Israel, including preferential treatment in terms of the pricing of Egypt's oil and gas. The UK government has turned a blind eye to virginity testing of female protesters, a blind eye against the violence against women. Protest law now means that there's a ban on any prospect that there may be a disturbance of the peace, and there are now probably more than 60,000 political prisoners. Egypt's rebranding is promoted by the US and by British public relations companies, including Sir Martin Sorrell of WPP, the world's biggest public relations company, Tony Blair and Richard Attiah Associates, Strategic Consulting, and Peter Mandelson's lobbying firm Global Counsel, which defended Mubarak during the uprisings. And Mandelson is now also the chair of the consulting firm Lazard's, which has also been hired by Sisi. Giulio's death is now submerged under the selection of Egypt's national values, the commercialization of its national heritage, the touting of funding for a new administrative capital of $45 billion at a time where there are simultaneously in Egypt food riots which prefaced the uprisings in January 2011. Egypt presents itself now as a low-wage economy with a pliant and agreeable working class. Italy's energy giant has just invested $10 billion over the next 5 years because they look for a strong government with neoliberal reforms, just as the British government does too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That covered a great deal in a very concise way. I think we're now going to have a little film, are we? Shane's going to operate that. Right. Our next speaker is Shane Enright, who is Global Trade Union Advisor for Amnesty International. He's a lifelong trade unionist who works to build links between trade unions and amnesty. This involves things like exposing repression of trade unionists, campaigning for their release when they've been imprisoned for representing their fellow workers. And he says he very much enjoys working and campaigning with his trade union friends for human rights. So I'll hand over to Shane next.
Thank you very much for that. Before I introduce myself properly and I get my first proper sight of the room as well, welcome to everyone. I'm going to just show a very short... I'm just going to show a very short 2-minute video, and then after you've seen it, I can then explain at some point what the movie's about. I'm trying to get it to scroll down a bit. Here we go.
Here, this is the passing of our fellow UWC USA alumnus.
Giulio Regeni, class of 2007, was a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge and an Italian citizen. He traveled to Egypt after the fall of the former President Mubarak in order to conduct his PhD research on the formation of independent trade unions.
Giulio disappeared on January 25th, 2016. He was found 9 days later bearing marks of torture. And here we are, 1 year later, still without truth.
Many accounts have risen about the circumstances of his disappearance. but General Khaled of the Ministry of Interior stated that Giulio had passed away because of a car crash. This version was subsequently denied, yet there was still no trace of the true story.
In the months that followed, the Minister of Interior has denied the accusations made against it by anonymous sources, instead proposing a second version stating that Giulio's identification was found in an apartment occupied by a gang specialized in kidnapping tourists.
Nonetheless, the Egyptian authorities' statements have been met with skepticism by the Italian government, but most of all by the Regeni family.
As of the moment, Amnesty International lacks information to determine whether Giulio's abduction resulted from the actions of state agents, gang members, or others. We still do not know what happened to Giulio Regeni, but today we stand together and demand the truth.
Giulio was a cherished member of our UWC community, and he will always stay in our heart and memory.
Verità per Giulio.
Truth for Giulio.
Verità per Giulio.
Truth for Giulio Regeni.
Verità per Giulio.
Truth for Giulio.
Verità per Giulio.
Okay, I'll explain why that short film is relevant later on, but as well as introducing myself, and thanks Leah for those very warm welcome remarks, I am a trade unionist and I'm by nature a mischief maker, and it's my hope and ambition to make mischief with you and with our colleagues at UCU. Amnesty International in the United Kingdom is unique, I believe, in our global movement in having a long-standing arrangement where trade unions affiliate to us. That means that the trade unions are the members of Amnesty International aren't external partners with whom we collaborate from time to time, but rather an integral internal constituency of Amnesty's activism in exactly the same way as our university and college student groups are an internal part of our movement, just as our schools groups are, just as our local our groups in towns and cities up and down the country. That arrangement in Amnesty UK has been in place for over 30 years, and in 2 to 3 years' time we'll be celebrating the 40th anniversary of that trade union network. So I'm a trade unionist, and one thing I'm definitely not, and I have to say this from the outset, is I'm not an Egypt expert. So I'm particularly appreciative that Ray gave us such a thorough panorama to set the scene for what I want to do in the time that I've got, which is to describe the origins and evolution of our campaign for Giulio and our response to the grave problem of enforced disappearances in Egypt. Let me start off by saying our campaign is explicitly not a campaign solely for Giulio Regeni. Now, overseas students, postdoctoral, postgraduate students studying in Egypt don't typically get murdered by their state. Giulio he was based in Cambridge, he was murdered, we believe, Amnesty International believe, by the state, bearing the hallmarks of torture. But maybe the only British or European overseas student to have been subject to enforced disappearance and a brutal death, but as Ray has emphasised to us, and as our own Amnesty International research shows, there is an intensification of enforced disappearances. In the last 18 months, over 1,100 cases have been reported and recorded, and there is a link on this web page, I'll show you later, to a very important piece of research that Amnesty published last summer. So in our efforts to campaign for truth for Giulio Regeni, we are equally insisting on justice for Egypt's disappeared. Giulio's case is the lens through which we can shine a light, particularly here in his home country of study, where we can bring attention not just to his plight, but of course to the wider problems that we're trying to tackle. So I don't want anyone in this room to think that somehow Amnesty International privileges, Western white victims of state violence over people who might be indigenous and who might suffer a similar fate. So our campaign is Truth for Giulio Regeni and Justice for Egypt's Disappeared. Now, shortly after Giulio's body was found in Italy, the Italian government withdrew their ambassador to that country, and the ambassador has not yet been returned. But I don't believe that that's because of any particular wish by the Italian authorities to prolong their saber rattling with the Egyptians. I believe it's purely the consequence of an absolutely enormous campaign led by Giulio's family, supported by Amnesty International, that swept Italy in the months after Giulio's death. And the scale of that campaign really has to be seen to be believed. Town halls up and down the country had Truth for Giulio placards on their balconies of prominent buildings. Universities up and down the country signed up to a pledge to honour Giulio's memory and to campaign for human rights to be respected in Egypt. And it's because of the momentum of that campaign that the Italians have been, to some degree, forced into a corner in terms of demanding truth and accountability from the Egyptian security forces. Now, I want to elaborate just a little bit on the excuses that Ray mentioned the Egyptian state had for what happened to Giulio. At least 3 different bits of misinformation were spread. Immediately in the days after his death, he was adjudged by the Egyptians to have been the victim of a road traffic accident, clearly laughable when the subsequent post-mortem indicated that his injuries were compatible with state torture. Secondly, it was suggested that Giulio had died as a consequence of a drug deal that had gone wrong. Well, there was absolutely no evidence of drugs in his system, nor was there any evidence that he'd ever been a habitual user of drugs. And then finally, the most extraordinary of all, as Ray has mentioned, following a shootout at a apparent stakeout, 4 people who allegedly kidnapped Giulio were all conveniently killed on site, and lo and behold, they must have been the gangsters responsible, because Giulio's mobile phone and wallet and other material suddenly appeared at this location. Well, none of those excuses will wash. None of them match the facts. The truth is that Giulio's fate is a fate which has been experienced by many others in Egypt, and we certainly in Amnesty International are demanding truth and accountability for him, but also an end to impunity, an end to the systematic disappearance of people. Now, we can speculate as much as we want about whether it was one arm of the security forces going rogue against another arm, or whether it was a case of having beaten them up so far they didn't know then what to do. All of that is mere speculation. What we want to see is accountability and an end to impunity, truth and justice for Giulio, and improved respect for human rights for all the others who suffered a similar fate to him. So I mentioned the campaign in Italy. Campaign in Italy is focused very much on pressing the Italian government to use its diplomatic leverage with the Egyptian authorities. In the UK, on the other hand, our campaign is directed, and it's included in the protest card I'll mention in a minute, our campaign is directed specifically at the Egyptians. And it's worth just unpicking for a moment why that might be. Now, it's absolutely the case that, as Ray has said, the British government has stayed largely silent when increasing widespread human rights abuses have swept through Egypt after 2011. Britain's been silent, as mentioned, on violence against women, silent on a whole range of acute abuses. And of course we could do more to make the British government, or to insist that the British government speak out. But we've deliberately not done so, because what we've not wanted to do is to blur the primary line of accountability towards the Egyptians, which is held by the Italians, is held by his family, and is being mobilised for that country, so from that country. And so what we decided instead to do is to adopt a traditional amnesty technique and campaign for change from the Egyptian authorities. Now, I have, I'm afraid, a substantial confession to make to you now, and that is that I put 50 copies of the action card and a whole bunch of placards for us to take a photo action. I put them in my bag, and lo and behold, sometime between yesterday and today, they seem to have walked away. I don't know quite how that happened, but I was on the train on the way here by the time I discovered that, and therefore I'm afraid I'm singularly ill-equipped. But what I am going to encourage you to do is to go to this webpage, which is amnesty.org.uk/Giulio, just /Giulio, you don't need to put in that long address, and if you look at that webpage, as well as including a short film about the wider problem of enforced disappearances, it also includes a link to the full research that we published last year, but it also describes our campus campaigns and how you can get involved. So this is how the campaign developed. Originally, after Giulio's death, his colleagues in Cambridge came together to take some local community-based action on his behalf. And the primary partners in this work were Amnesty International Cambridge Student Group, Amnesty International City Group in Cambridge, the University and College Union, the National Union of Journalists, and the Cambridge Trades Council. And they were very successful in raising local attention to Giulio's plight and in mobilising both town and gown to call for accountability and truth. And so when last year the University and College Union, which represents 130,000, I believe, now 130,000 academics and lecturers up and down the country, passed a policy calling for justice and truth for Giulio Regeni, for Egypt's disappeared. Amnesty International and myself in the UK, we were extremely keen to develop a collaborative campaign. So what we've done is we've brought our Student Action Network, which represents all our student groups up and down the country, together with our trade union network that brings together all our trade union partners, and have decided to develop a campus campaign, a collaborative campus campaign. So all the details about that are on this webpage. And what we're asking UCU branches to do, so UCU here in Leeds, is we're asking UCU in Leeds to reach out to the Amnesty International Student Group in Leeds, to reach out to the City Group in Leeds, and to come together to promote the signing of these cards on campuses. It could be at student union meetings, it could be at UCU branch meetings, it could be at Trades Council meetings, but to get as many cards signed up as possible. And the second thing that we're asking campus trade unions and Amnesty supporters to do is to get hold of some of the placards that we will be promoting on this webpage, which say "Truth for Giulio," and use them to take a photo action in some prominent local landmark in your university or on your campus. And obviously, if you can get that into the local student or community newspaper, that would be very, very helpful indeed. So that's two things to do. One, to order copies of these cards and circulate them amongst your communities and at public meetings and events. Second, to take part in a group photo action. And then the third thing that we encourage you to do, and I do have a few of these which are on the front table here, is if you wish to, and it's not part of Amnesty's campaign, in recognition of the very moving testimonial from Giulio's American student friends at the UWC University in New Mexico, that's their video that we've just seen, they have decided to set up a fund specifically to fund Egyptian scholarships to study at the UWC Adriatic campus, which is the campus that's closest to where Giulio had lived, and of course it's a specific initiative to support Egyptian students to study in Italy, and there's a Just Giving donation page there. So as I say, that's not an Amnesty initiative, but it's certainly a welcome and positive step that I'd draw your attention to and encourage you to support if you feel able. So in terms of what the campaign will look like in Leeds or anywhere else, that will be entirely for you to decide, your own communities to decide what will work for you. So the campaign period, we're collecting cards up until May. And so in May, we will weigh them all. It's usually the most efficient way of counting postcards. I'll tell you when we get them in. We will weigh them all. Now we will organise a trade union and Amnesty delegation to go to the Egyptian embassy to hand them in. Now that's going to be very helpful for us because these cards are directed to the Office of the Public Prosecutor and they don't accept post in Cairo. They're apparently impossible to get hold of in Egypt. So the best way of influencing them is in fact to go through the UK embassy. And we will almost certainly also have some sort of stunt or demo on that day as well. So if you're into chanting or if your favourite outerwear, fashionable apparel is a yellow branded tabard, then we will have opportunities for you to join in. So I'm going to ask you to carry on visiting this page because we also have listed at the bottom a sequence of events. In fact, most of them have now disappeared because some of them have just taken place recently. But we've had events in Cambridge. We've had events at the London School of Economics. There was an event very recently in Warwick. There's your own event here in Leeds, and I'm pleased to announce two more venues on this ever-increasing roadshow. And that's Kingston University and Queen Mary University, and they will be listed when those events are live. They will be listed on that page too. And all of these events are an initiative of University and College Union working together with the Egypt Solidarity Initiative in support of the Amnesty campaign, which basically means you do all the organising and I get to come along and see if I can motivate some of you to take action. So that's really all I wanted to say. A relatively straightforward description of this phase of the campaign. I want to pick up just two other issues. One is we're doing this phase of the campaign until May, and we're doing it for the very simple common sense reason that students and academics tend to get quite busy after May. Busier. I'm sorry, I stand properly corrected. But that doesn't mean we're ending the campaign. We don't walk away. We're not simply walking away in May. We will, at that point, re-evaluate where we are. We will also be talking to other trade union partners, particularly the National Union of Journalists, who've expressed a wish to collaborate with us. And of course what they want to do with us might be something rather different from the campus initiative that was so appealing to UCU. So the campaign will continue. Any new initiatives or any new opportunities or any new resources will be at the webpage www.amnesty.org.uk.co.uk/Giulio. And yeah, I'm ready to take any questions if any of you have got any questions. I don't. One?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. If I could just make one or two brief comments from UCU and then we'll finish recording and open it up for questions and discussion. I think first of all this issue about people disappearing, if you think about it for a moment, it's very cruel for the families and friends, isn't it? Disappearance is in a sense worse than knowing that somebody's in prison, or sometimes even worse than knowing they've been murdered, because you just don't know. And there are parts of the world, Colombia is one of the cases, where people have sometimes disappeared for years on end. And there's that terrible fading of hope, perhaps, as the years go by. There's that terrible uncertainty about what's happened. So, the reason that repressive regimes use disappearance as a torture weapon, really, because it's torturing the families and friends, is because of the terrible uncertainty it creates and the fear that somebody's disappeared. You've got to try and find them. If you can get them located in a prison, see if they get access to a lawyer and so on. Secondly, for UCU, why is this so important? I think, there are perhaps two branches, Leeds and Cambridge, which have a particular role to play because Giulio was a student there. There are very real issues of freedom to study, freedom to research, academic freedom in cases like this. I know from my own experience when I was working as a university lecturer, even for undergraduate projects, whenever we let students out in the field, we make them fill in forms. We couldn't drive them mad doing it. But we make them fill in forms about where they're going, when they'll be back, who they'll be in touch with, if they've got a mobile phone with them. We have all sorts of safety protocols when students go out in the field. We don't just go out and say, just go and research that. We check that people are safe as far as possible. But then we have something terrible like this happen, where somebody, he wasn't there as a political activist, he was there as an academic researcher, because he was studying something that seems contentious. He's murdered. Well, it raises all sorts of issues about what you can and can't safely study, what you could send students to study, and so on. And lastly, Shane mentioned the NUJ, and I think there are certain links between UCU and NUJ which we need to develop, because we have a common problem. We see this whether it's the repression in Turkey or the repression in Egypt or many parts of the world. If journalists go and cover a demonstration, they get accused of being protesters. And then if the protesters are defined as terrorists, the journalists are told they're terrorists too. I was a sociology lecturer for many years. I'm very aware of the prejudice that, of course, social problems exist because social scientists write about them. As a number of you encountered that one, So if you report on certain things, say you report on protest groups, you study them, whether as an academic or a journalist, you then become defined as a protester, as a subversive, as part of the enemy within, and so on, and are then seen as a suitable case for being sacked from your job, or perhaps imprisoned and tortured, and so on. So that, the right to investigate things, whether as a journalist or an academic researcher, is put into question if you're immediately seen as a subversive, simply because you study certain phenomena. So there are real issues of freedom of speech, press freedom, academic freedom, which are involved. Okay, I think that's enough from me. Have we stopped the filming? Is that enough? Right, can I say, by the way, Christian does have a list I think he's passing around if you could sign if you want to get it, so we could send you the postcards. We apologise for not having them today, but if you could, sign them. We have got till May, and if you could get some for family and friends, the more postcards the better. And it will be sufficient numbers to weigh, not to count, so I think that's important. Right, can I ask the questions from the floor? If I perhaps could take three at a time.